My name in the Ojibwe language is Gigi Wewadam Ukwe, or in English, speaks with a clear and loud voice woman. I'm a member of the White Earth Nation, and my family is the Wolf Clan. And the role of our clan is to ensure that we never leave anyone behind. That's why I am supporting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to be the next president and vice president of the United States.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. There are 27 days until the election, which means that some of you, if you live in a red state, probably have missed your deadline to register if you haven't already registered to vote. Elsewhere, you might be able to register. Please check your registration now, even if you're pretty sure you can do registration at the polls. Just check it, and vote if you already are able to vote. This is a show where we talk to smart people about what they're noticing and thinking about in this wild, unhinged, unprecedented, constantly changing election. And today I'm talking to smart person Rebecca Nagle, who is the author of By the Fire We Carry, the generations-long fight for justice on Native land. It's out from HarperCollins. She is a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get into it.
Okay. Well, then just go. Should I ask you what's top of mind? Or would you like to just I'll just set you off, please?
Oh, man.
I could set you up a little bit more if that's helpful.
No, I think I can jump in. Well, why not? Feet first. One thing I have been thinking about a lot lately as I see sort of the punditry and the commentary swirl around is I hear a lot of people talk about how this historical moment is unprecedented, and that and the other thing I hear a lot is that democracy itself is at stake, right? Those are the stakes, and we're in this sort of critical juncture. Um, and I think we've actually been here before, and we've been here multiple times. And I think it's from not fully knowing and understanding our history that we get to this place where we think, oh, wow, this is new, this is different. And so one of the things that I researched while writing the book and that the book gets into is the 1830s and the policy of the United States towards Indigenous people at that time. And so and there's a lot of parallels between that moment and our present day. And so Andrew Jackson won in a landslide in 1828, and what he campaigned on was that the 1824 election, in which he very narrowly and controversially lost to John Quincy Adams. It was actually settled by Congress. Was stolen. And so he campaigned in 1828 on the idea of having lost a stolen election, and he won on a landslide. And a lot of people considered him sort of, and still, the first, populist president of the United States. And his signature policy was the ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people from what was then the territorial limits of the U.S. And he actually worked hand in hand in tandem with Southern states. And so sort of the way that we see, certain states being at the forefront of different policies, that was happening in the 1830s, and Georgia was actually harassing Cherokees on our land and trying to force us to agree to go by making our lives so miserable. And we won a Supreme Court case saying that was illegal. We won Worcester v. Georgia, but then Jackson refused to follow it. Jackson defied the Supreme Court. It was a constitutional crisis. But instead of, impeaching Jackson or holding Georgia in contempt, the country just kind of moved on. And what that moving on resulted in was actually the Trail of Tears, not just for Cherokee Nation, but for multiple tribes within the United States at that time. And so I just think that We do a lot of comparing of Trump to authoritarian leaders abroad. We talk about the frailty of our democracy as if this frailty is new and it hasn't always been frail. And I think instead of looking abroad or looking outward to sort of understand how we got into this political moment, I think we would be better served by looking inward and looking at our own history.
I love that point. And I think it's really important. And I think the difference between then and now is a greater population of white people and privileged people who are able to recognize
I
the
actually
number
don't
of people.
agree.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
I actually don't agree. And I think this is another part of history that's
Love
lost.
it.
Like, I think we think like the people of 1830 hated Indigenous people and just wanted to get rid of them. But it was actually extremely controversial. And I think you could argue that the majority of US citizens opposed Indian removal. But because of the undemocratic ways that our government was set up, the policy went through. And so because it was actually a congressional bill, and when it got to Congress, it was extremely controversial. And so the opposition was led by Northern Christian white folks. And so they actually organized the largest petition drive in US history. Women who had never before in the United States participated in public political actions actually organized their own petition. So the first time white or any women, but the first time white women participated publicly in politics was to try and stop the Indian Removal Act. And there was a huge groundswell of opposition to it. And when you look at the vote, and it was really divided geographically. So people in the North were opposed, and people in the South, where Indigenous nations still had a lot of land and they coveted that land, supported it. And if it wasn't for the 3/5 clause, which gave Southern states disproportionate representation in Congress because enslaved people who, of course, could not vote were counted towards the South's representation, the bill actually would not have passed. And so it's actually interesting because one of the things that the activists of the 1830s would say is that, this is sort of in the adolescent years of the republic, the idea of American democracy is still fresh. There's still sort of this open question of like, is this even going to work? And one of the things that people would say is that our government is supposed to govern according to the will of the people. And if this bill is rammed through over the opposition of what is actually wanted in our democracy will fail. That was the conversation happening in the 1830s.
Okay, I can't decide if that's heartening or even more depressing. Because on the one hand, good on my ancestors. Like, although I have some ancestors from like Minnesota, so I'm going to non-slaveholding ancestors. So good on them. Good on America. Good on that discussion. Yay. But it didn't work. So that actually now, the parallel is even more direct, right? Like that, I think, is what you're saying, if I am hearing you correctly, is that there hasn't been a change. There hasn't been a sea change of a kind that is unprecedented. Like, I think there has been historical forgetting. I do think that there has been changes, and there's a reason why we forgot it, which is to say there's been complacency that happened after that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think...
But also, if I can just say, I do think you're correct, and this is something that we've talked about on this program before, is that if everyone who could vote was able to vote, we would have a vastly different looking country. We would have a vastly different set of policies, because the fact is, the policies that the GOP, the MAGA GOP, wants to institute are not popular. They are not what most Americans want to see. So on that point, what you've reminded us of is that can not matter very much at all.
I think too, it's that those ideas that there are levers that have been put in place in our democracy and on purpose to make our democracy less democratic, right? And so those things are still in place. And so when we think about proportional representation, like one person gets one vote, there are all of these things, whether it's um, the Senate or the Electoral College, that shifts that. And that shift in the 1830s was, the Three-Fifths Clause and the disproportionate representation that the South had because of that, and the political power that they had because of that. Um, the other thing I would say is that I think as an Indigenous person, seeing our issue be central in a political debate is actually something I don't see today. And I don't really see a broad swath of people care about Native issues or even be aware. And so, one thing that happened while this one Supreme Court case over the rights of Cherokee Nation was being argued, so many members from the House of Representatives attended that the House actually adjourned so that people could go. There were speeches on the Indian Removal Act that literally lasted for days. So people, like representatives who were opposed and people who wanted it to pass, would spoke on the House floor for literal days about the bill. And it was kind of a central issue in the United States. And I don't know that we still have that level of interest in our issues today. And I don't, I can't really think of very many moments, even in my lifetime. I mean, I think the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock is probably the closest. And that's, been 1 6-month period in my 38-year life that I think there's been like collective national attention on the issues that are relevant to Native people. And so I think there's a way where, yes, there's like more understanding of different issues now than there were in the 1830s, but then in some ways I don't know how much the needle has moved. It's like I read those letters and I read those petitions from the activists of 1830s, and I think in some ways they understood tribal sovereignty and Indigenous issues more than our public does today. I don't know. It's hard to say.
I can only speak from my experience in moving among fairly progressive communities where there is a higher awareness of when we say BIPOC, right? Are we really, are we including Indigenous people in the conversation when that word gets uttered? I think that there is more awareness around some representation, but yes. I am saying you're completely right, but I'm also saying that my experience is limited and there might be more conversations happening that I'm not hearing, right? Like that's super possible. That's not just possible. That is true. But I don't want to overstate. Like I can't just, what you're saying sounds right to me. And also if you just look at coverage, right? If we just look at what is happening in legacy media and even left-wing progressive media, you're not seeing the conversation that you're talking about. And that is, I could use the word tragic. And I'm serious because I think something, one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on is something I heard you say in an interview, I think, that the Indigenous people are the canaries in the coal mine of civil rights, right? You're just on the front line of that. In some ways, literally, like from the past, right? If we look at the original genocide, the original oppression of people in the geographic area that we now call the United States, which had other names before, that was Indigenous people, right? But it's not just true historically. It continues to be true.
And that quote, that canary in the coal mine, is actually from a guy named Felix Cohen, who's one of the early scholars of what we call federal Indian law, which is just the body of law that governs the relationship between Indigenous nations and the U.S. federal government. And so he said that, Indigenous nations are the canary in the coal mine, and they're sort of the first place where the poisonous gases in our democracy show up. And in the book, By the Fire We Carry, one of the points that I make is this conversation we're having now about the Supreme Court and how folks are concerned that the Supreme Court has taken on more power than really what's within its constitutional bounds, and is breaking with precedent, is not following what Congress has said. And all those patterns were happening in the arena of federal Indian law decades before this recent growing concern about the Supreme Court. And so since the 1950s, tribes and tribal interests have lost the majority of cases that went before the Supreme Court. And then since the 90s, tribes and tribal interests have lost 2/3 of cases in front of the Supreme Court. And sometimes the court follows the law and follows both what Congress and then also like straight up what the Constitution says. And most of the time when the Supreme Court follows the law, actually tribes win. But often the justices don't like where the law gets them. When in the law, tribes have a legal right, a treaty right, the courts come up with creative and inventive ways to get around that. We've actually had some really big setbacks, specifically around what kind of jurisdiction tribes have on tribal land, that have come directly from the Supreme Court. And so, whether it's the growing concern around the Supreme Court adhering to precedent, or really kind of the power the Supreme Court has in our democracy, and how it's, sort of different than the balance of power. Many legal scholars are criticizing it, for sort of jumping outside of its bounds and not, deferring to Congress or deferring to the other branches when it should. That was going on in federal Indian law for a very long time. And so I think that's just one example of how I think if more people had been paying attention sooner, that some of these things, could have maybe been discussed before it was kind of too late.
Do you see or see, sense, feel? I don't know how you can see a poison gas, but I wanted to ask you if there are other poison gases that most people aren't aware of that are taking place among Indigenous peoples that you would sound an alarm for.
Yeah, I mean, all sorts of stuff. I mean, I think that, when it comes to climate change, a lot of Indigenous nations are in frontline communities. I mean, healthcare, COVID, climate resiliency, water, all these things, housing, literally every issue, were.
I just, I suspected that might be the case, but I was wondering if there's stuff that,
absolutely. I mean, and I think, one of the ways that anti-Indigenous racism functions, in the year of our Lord 2024 is erasure. So going back kind of to the election, in 2020 on election night, CNN was covering exit polls in Arizona, and they had a graphic that was exit polls by race. And instead of listing the category of Native Americans, they called Native people, quote, something else. And that happens over and over again. And so, early on in the COVID pandemic, when people were starting to talk about racial disparities, Native people were not part of that conversation. And it was deeper than even just the media not reporting on it. States that were collecting data by race weren't collecting data that included Native people. So we often get put in data sets into this like other category. And so that was happening with COVID and by places like the city of LA, like, and so that level of erasure happens, at the level of news media, at the level of like public health data. And so all of these issues that are impacting us, just as much as other Americans, we could just get completely left out of the conversation. And I feel like it's happening with this election too. Native voters are a substantial portion of the population in several key swing states, including Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Particularly in Arizona, the number of eligible Native voters way outnumber the margin that Biden won by in 2020. And when you actually look at how precincts on tribal land voted, um, a lot of precincts on tribal land in Arizona went for Biden by over 90%, in really high margins. But you don't hear pundits talking about it. You don't hear pundits talking about it at all. Instead, they're sort of like, okay, suburban white women with a college degree who don't have children and like to drink wine and have 5 cats. How are they going to vote? It's just sort of like,
okay.
in all of the little categories of people, I've been waiting to hear, and I have not yet heard a national political commentator be like, okay, what's going on with the Native vote? Like, how is that happening? And that, I think that erasure translates directly to a diminishment of our political power.
Okay. I'm going to count us as a national political commentator. So it's not a huge platform, but I think it's important. I wanted to ask you, but I think I know that Minnesota is another place where there's a large population of Indigenous voters. When I lived in Minnesota, I did a service commitment where I went to a youth, I don't think they call them prisons youth incarcerated youth center, actually in Red Wing. And the largest minority population in that place were Indigenous young men. That is where I learned what a large population of Indigenous people there were in Minnesota. And Minnesota did elect Peggy Flanigan. I know we're not a swing state. I'm going to count myself still up there. Oh, but my vote wouldn't count as much as it does down here. Well, my vote. Anyway. How do you see the fact that she might be a larger part of the national conversation should Tim Walz win? She will be the first Indigenous governor in the United States ever.
Yeah, and she'll be the first Native woman governor. So Oklahoma's had a governor that was, one is controversial, but the other one is less. But so we've had
one of them might not have been fully counted.
Yeah, our current governor, Kevin Stitt, is a citizen of my tribe, Cherokee Nation. It's a long story. There's compelling evidence that his ancestors, because we use lineal descent, and so, at a specific time in the early 1900s, if your ancestors were citizens of our tribe or were on this one roll that was actually created by the federal government, then you can enroll today. And there is very compelling evidence that his ancestors obtained that by bribery and fraud. So,
first, Peggy Flanigan, first female Indigenous,
first female Native
governor, and very active in Indigenous rights.
Yeah, and there's, how tribes fit into, just to give a real basic, I guess, like civics lesson, tribes are a layer of government, just like, the city, the county, the state layer of government. So tribes, are paving roads, helping people get access to water, providing healthcare, providing education. But they have a really unique relationship with states because we are sovereign indigenous nations, and that relationship goes back to our treaty relationship with the federal government. So just like Oklahoma can't, change international ties with like Canada or Mexico, it can't rewrite the government's relationship with, my tribe, Cherokee Nation, or another tribe in Oklahoma. But often states deeply resent the lack of power that they have, and are fighting with tribes for power, for jurisdiction, for land, for resources. And, going all the way back to that court case I was talking about, Georgia v. Worcester, there's a long history of antagonism between tribes and states. And so I think what's exciting about Peggy Flanigan is having a leader in a state who not only can advance those tribal state relationships in Minnesota, but hopefully also model that, for other governments in other states across the country. Um, and so, it would be nice if states and tribes weren't, in constant conflict with each other, which happens a lot. Um, and so that's what when I think about Peggy Flanigan, is, is what I'm most excited about. And I think, representation, having, people in elected office isn't the beginning and end of the struggle for tribal sovereignty, but I do think it helps, and I don't think we can see representation as an endpoint. And I think when we see it that way, it can be, less helpful, or it can be even counterproductive. But I think when we see it as a step along the way, I think it is very helpful because, you talk to, Native members of Congress, and, they're constantly educating their peers about what a tribe is, what is a federally recognized tribe, how do these laws work? And, they talk about being the only Native person in the room and having to constantly push these issues that people can be so ignorant about. And so I think having a Native person in that role and having that visibility can help those issues have that visibility. But that's, visibility isn't the end goal. Is just to be like more visible. It's that's hopefully a step towards better public policy for tribes.
And I want to be clear, actually. So that way that I learned about the large population in Minnesota is tragic. It's tragic. Like, I want to be clear that, like, that's what I've felt about that like, it's such an invisible issue that I want to call it my own ignorance on that. Like,
yeah.
And I also want to say that is such a large piece of emotional labor and such an extra job to have, to be the only Indigenous person in the room and to have to educate your fellow people, right, of any kind. Like, that's something that, we've kind of learned about other forms of representation, that's an ask that you're making, right? It is a job that you didn't run for. If you're in office, I didn't run to be the educator of my peers. So that's another place where having this be a part of the larger issue, you're taking a load off of all this work that Indigenous people have to do if they're the only people in the room, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a role for, like, just finding out more. For instance, perhaps buying somebody's book. I think that might be a step that people could take, a very concrete one. I happen to know this author that's done a lot of recent work. Her name is Rebecca Nagle. You might also listen to her podcast on Crooked Media about I've forgotten the name of that law, the adoption.
Oh, yeah. The Indian Child Welfare Act.
The Indian Child Welfare Act. So, INCWA, that's how it has, like, a funny acronym.
ICWA. Yeah.
ICWA. Right.
Yeah.
And that's just like, if people are listening and like, what can I do? There is just like a piece of that is just no more. I mean, it's not enough. It's not making it a part of the conversation. I wanted to mention two things that I've thought about recently or have seen recently as far as the poisonous gases being released. That Indigenous people are in direct, contact with. I heard a report on the decline in overdoses in the U.S., which is, hard to say. That's not a good thing. The report I heard was like, important to note, this isn't happening among Indigenous people. Their actually overdoses went up. I just thought that was like, oh, I guess good to notice, but maybe we should look into that. Like, maybe that's a forward-looking thing and not like, oh, an exception.
Yeah. And I can give an example from my own tribe and how to tie it all back together, how the Supreme Court has hurt our ability to fight things like that. So, I don't know if you remember those big lawsuits brought by states against pharmacies that overprescribed opioids and, flooded Ohio and places like that with, a level of opioids that led to, these high addiction rates. Well, my tribe, Cherokee Nation, filed a similar suit against pharmacies in our area that had flooded our reservation with opioids. And we were told by the courts that we didn't have the legal authority to bring that kind of a lawsuit. And that's 100% thanks to the Supreme Court. And so in the early 80s, the courts ruled that tribes don't have what's called civil jurisdiction. So we actually wanted to hear the case and try the case in our own court system. And we're not allowed to bring like a Walgreens or a Walmart to task within our court system because the Supreme Court said that we don't have civil jurisdiction over non-native businesses, even when they're conducting business on our land, unless they threaten the health and the well-being of the tribe, or are in a consensual relationship with the tribe, like a contract. And unfortunately, as we can see with the opioid case, we tried to bring that those Montana exceptions are hardly ever met. And so, just thinking about, how these issues disproportionately impact Indigenous nations and the Supreme Court and all of these politics, these aren't issues that are existing in isolation where it's just like, oh, well, we just, have more addiction. There are these structural issues that are contributing to that.
Yeah, and the other one I wanted to bring up because it is even more directly related to it's an election issue that has gotten a lot of those suburban white women with college degrees to drink wine and have cats, which, by the way, I don't drink, but otherwise, me. Also didn't vote for Trump in the past, which is another of those micro-targeting that they're talking about. But another issue that has gotten a lot of people really activated and involved is reproductive rights.
Yeah.
And where that was the absence of control over one's bodily autonomy, I know has been an incredibly urgent issue on Native land because of the lack of just not because it's illegal necessarily, but the lack of access. The reproductive care deserts that a lot of Americans are affected by, but I know is something that Indigenous people have been experiencing for, I don't know, decades. Is that the right word?
And we're also impacted by the Hyde Amendment because a lot of the healthcare that Native people access is federally funded.
Yeah. If people don't know, that's actually the name of the amendment that I was blanking on last week's episode with Terrence Woodbury. Hyde Amendment, yes. That is the amendment that doesn't allow federal funding for abortions, and that was a compromise by the Democrats with pro-life Republicans and a couple of pro-life Democrats that has served to be an example of how compromises are not compromises, but rather losses. right? That like the Democrats' willingness to compromise on choice is actually like hurts people, right? It has a material impact on the lives of so many people, including Indigenous people. And that was like, I'm realizing now, of course, like because of the erasure, that's not even a thing that people were probably thinking about. They weren't like, oh, what kind of people really access reproductive care through federal funding?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, the Indian Health Services, or people call it IHS, is, like when I get like my PCP, or when I go into like my women's health clinic, or even just to get my teeth cleaned, I go to my tribe's facility. And so yeah, so we're limited by what IHS provides. And it's not even just, people think about abortion, but it's other stuff. So I don't think it's out yet, but my friend Allison Herrera, who is an amazing journalist, is coming out very soon with this story about access to Plan B at IHS facilities. And so she spent a year tracking down, where if you call as a patient, can you even just access Plan B? And what she found was pretty shocking. So if people want to look out for that, I think that reporting is going to be out in the next couple weeks.
She used to be a producer on my old podcast.
I know.
Allison. Which, speaking of, I wanted to bring up again, the podcast you did about ICWA is This Land. And
yes.
There is a place where people can make just this individual action to do something about the conversation that we're having that should include Indigenous people, which is educate yourself on these things, your podcast, your book, which is By the Fire We Carry, the Generations Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. And I wanted to ask you if there's other stuff that you're thinking about or looking at that we should be bringing up to a greater part of the conversation we're happening, especially around the election.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's just really hard with Native issues because I feel like that seeing that erasure and thinking, gosh, we should be part of the conversation is just, unfortunately, is just constant. This fall, it happened again with all of the data about enrollment at elite colleges after the Supreme Court gutted affirmative action. And the enrollment at certain colleges for Native students also plummeted. So at Harvard, it fell by about half. And that wasn't included, and at a lot of these elite colleges, Native enrollment was already dismally low. And now it's even lower after this decision. And I think there's a unique way because we're not considered a racial group, we're considered a political group. And so there are actually unique ways that colleges could be asking about tribal citizenship and enrollment and partnering with tribes in ways that actually wouldn't be impacted by the Supreme Court's decision. But because people don't know about these issues and it's not at the front of the mind, I haven't seen that conversation. So yeah, I would just say that those issues whenever you're thinking about a political issue, whether it's jobs, housing, the economy, all those things impact Native nations, but how it's impacting us is often just completely left out of the conversation. And for folks who are I think going back to what you said about like steps people can take, I always tell people wherever you're getting your news, here we are on a podcast or on YouTube, to add Native voices to that mix. So one podcast I listen to is Native America Calling, and it's like a call-in talk show. And sometimes I listen to like the whole show, but up at the top of the show, they have like the day's headlines of like what's happening with tribes across the country. And it's just really helpful to listen to those headlines. ICT News also has a newscast that's similar. Well, they'll have headlines up top and then longer stories. And so it's kind of the same way I listen to like Democracy Now, where it's like sometimes I listen to the whole episode and sometimes I catch the headlines just to kind of know what's going on. So those are a couple resources. But wherever, if you're a big TikTok person, if you're really on Twitter, if you're all up on Instagram, if YouTube is your thing, just, find some native voices and some native creators and outlets on those platforms and just click follow and start to try and add that stuff into the mix of stuff that you're consuming.
It's another reminder that in this election, the issues are so ingrained and systemic that we cannot stop after election day, or even, God willing, universe willing, if the less fascist candidates win. It is still a long, hard fight. In fact, in some ways it might be harder because people will be less activated.
Yeah.
And there's going to be the fight that happens after the election. I think we had to be realistic about that. The actions that will be taken then by Trump and et cetera are setting themselves up for. And then there is the even harder fight, which comes after it's easy to get complacent.
Yes.
Because I don't know. That feels like the harder part for me, because the levers aren't so obvious that you can pull. It just takes more community work and like less visible individual actions.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's a weird time on the left right now because I think there's a lot happening that is deserving of criticism. I think especially what's happening in Gaza and also really what's happening with immigration and the continuing this dismantling of the asylum process and moving further and further away from having a humane approach to immigration and having, Democrats have really moved further right and more towards this hardline approach. And I think, if we had a different president, setting limits on the number of people that could apply for asylum or like shutting down the border on certain days, there would be more outrage than what I hear. And so I think that your point about how sometimes when there's a victory, an electoral victory that can be followed by complacence, I think that is part of what's happening right now, where there was this focus and a lot of attention and energy when some of these policies were coming from the other side. But now that, some of them have literally stayed in place, especially with immigration, and some of them have been continued, that focus has, I personally, I feel like it's really dwindled. And so I think that that's one thing that's hard as people, as the right moves further to the right, and then Democrats keep trying to sort of woo the center, the policies of the Democratic Party move further to the right as well.
There was this moment of vibe change that was very exciting, especially as my adopted home state of Minnesota. I feel like I have, dual citizenship right now. And the feeling of kind of relief.
Yeah.
That Biden was no longer at the top of the ticket. I think I had gotten very alienated from the process myself. Like I was going to vote, I was going to do what I could, but but I mean, the stakes are high and the choices are poor.
Yeah.
And it is difficult to hold in your head both great memes, just stellar memes. I just want to really emphasize how much I like those feral 25-year-olds on the Harris campaign doing their thing. And the level of not enoughness.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the opposite of uplifting. But when I think about this election and I think about like my own reasons, that when I think about my own reasons to vote and my own reasons to, participate in politics and all of that stuff, sometimes it is in hope and the hope that things will get better or move further towards, what my personal vision of justice is. But the other thing that I hold uh, as very true is the capacity for things to get worse, and that worse isn't felt equally by different members of our society, right? And so when things get worse, it's gonna be people who have less privilege, trans kids, undocumented folks, women in states without abortion, especially women who don't have the funds to travel, um, and access care, all those things. And I think what we've realized and learned about our country in the past decade is I think we've often kept this story of sort of progress and sort of this idea of this great arc of American progress. And I think history is just a lot more complicated than that, than sort of easier, than this easier idea of like linear progression. But I think in that knowledge that things can get worse, even though that sounds maybe pessimistic, for me, it's still a reason, to fight. Um, and to believe in these issues. And so sometimes, yeah, I feel like we don't often hear in the way that we teach history about people stopping things from happening because, you stop something from happening. So it's like doesn't really make the history books. But those fights are really important. Those fights are really important too.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the stories that I have told myself just in my personal life that sometimes can be kind of depressing because I see what I've gone through and I get pessimistic about, it's another actually personal. I want to be optimistic when I talk to other people, but sometimes,
Yeah.
And one thing that I remind myself is look at all I've survived, right? And I think that might be one way to incorporate what you're saying. Like, it's look at all the fights, right? What you're saying about stopping the things that didn't happen. Like, look at all the fights that have been had, and that can be a source. That's what literally resiliency. The fights we've had indicate that more fights can be had if we're willing to have them. I'm not trying to put a silver lining on this. I want to avoid toxic positivity, but I also don't want people to like just go home and cry. So it's not impossible. I think that's what I'm taking from this. It's like I said, the stakes are high and the options are poor, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really nice. It was really nice to sit down and talk.
Yeah, really value your perspective. And I'll remind people you have a new book out from HarperCollins called By the Fire We Carry, The Generations-Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. And you were my colleague back at Crooked with your podcast, This Land, about the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Yes.
And remind people this is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. There are, can't fucking believe it, 27 days until the election. Please check your registration. Make sure you're registered if you're not registered. Get registered if you can vote wherever you are. Please vote. And then also, a not as important election, but still valuable, is that this podcast got nominated for a Signal Award, and it would be helpful to me and my team here to be able to continue produce this show, which I love and love doing for all of you. So go vote at signalawards.com. This is available if you're watching on YouTube, it's available as a podcast. If you're listening as a podcast, it's available on YouTube. In both of those arenas, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends and neighbors. On YouTube, I should say, it's at youtube.com/@90 days with Ana Marie Cox, and then 90 is 90. And thank you again, Rebecca. I just really appreciate your point of view.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Vice President then invited me to join her at her residence for the Earth Day celebration this past year, purposefully bringing me together with philanthropic funders who are interested in the community's ideas for solar-covered canals, which has since led to a very productive dialogue that I'm hopeful will lead to investment and expansion of this groundbreaking way to save water and tackle the root cause of the drought we are facing, climate change. This is the kind of partner Vice President Harris is to Indian country.